I see product operations really as like PMing the PM experience.
You're describing your role as PM and the PM experience, and how is it really different from normal product management, and why is it important to even have such a role in an organization?
Product management is a lot about making the right product decision, and that rightness is really, really subjective.
I wanted to ask you about the iCertainty project. What motivated you to start it, and what are you doing with that?
The Uncertainty project was something that we co-founded together essentially as a community, focused on really decision making and strategy and the way that we end up doing that type of thing.
Another thing I wanted to ask you is about meetings.
I think that meetings have gotten really a bad rep. And the reason why is that people feel like it's one of the biggest productivity problems that people have is being in too many meetings. Like, you're not stuck in traffic, you are traffic. And I think it's a really good example of the fact that we are the reason why meetings are bad.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Lyoshin podcast. Today we have a new guest, Chris Butler. He is, as he described himself, chaotic, good product manager and writer and speaker. And he's been leading product teams at Google and Facebook and Microsoft, Waze, just to name a few companies. And now he's a staff product operations manager at GitHub. Welcome, Chris. Nice to have you here.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here and excited to talk all things product and whatever else.
Yeah, absolutely. So, today I'd like to talk to you about product management and product teams, and also maybe touch a little bit on the future of product management, where we're going and things like that.
Yeah.
But before we jump into the topics, could you tell a little bit about your professional journey and the work that you do now?
Sure. Yeah. I guess I'd say that overall I'm a product manager. I think that's the identity that I associate with the most, but I've done a lot of other roles. I've been a co-founder for a startup. I've done engineering. I've done graphic design as an apprentice for my dad. I guess you could say for a little while I was like a gray hat hacker in high school, or just like a person that did computer stuff. I've done business development. I've done sales. So there's just a lot of different things. I do a lot of user research. So I think about myself as a very broad type of person that does a lot of different things. But I was even just having a conversation with my manager at GitHub earlier today, just about kind of the future of my career. And it ends up being very weird, I guess. I said on the podcast with John Cutler that I kind of have an octopus career. And I do believe that there's a lot of different identities that I think of when it comes to the way I do my work. But I think there is kind of a centralized practice, and that centralized practice ends up being an awful lot about how do we use kind of the, I guess, lessons from other domains, other professions, other practices to be able to make really decision-making and building great products for customers as something that we can do really well. Of course, I'm excited about a lot of other kind of interesting and weird topics. But yeah, I guess the journey really has been varied for me, right? So apprenticing as a design person in high school to my dad, doing a lot of weird computer and phone stuff during high school, going into engineering during college, and then kind of immediately afterwards going to Microsoft and joining as a program manager. And this was before really product management was as popular as it is today. It kind of felt almost at first that I was being shunted to a different, less valuable topic. But I've told this story before, but I think the thing that really was interesting to me is being asked the question, how would you, during the interviews, while I was in school for Microsoft, was, how would you design a washer dryer combination for someone that was sight impaired? And that type of kind of understanding the context of the person, what problems are they dealing with, was really exciting for me. And I felt like I was doing a lot of that during all of my senior projects were really about me trying to pull together what is the right thing to build. And then I would kind of build it. It was okay. But I wouldn't say that I was an amazing engineer. I was an okay engineer. I could understand a lot of the engineering concepts, but I wouldn't say that I was the best coder necessarily. And so from that perspective, I think I went into program management, which at the time was some weird combination of product and project management at Microsoft. Dealing with a lot of Gantt charts in MS Project and also doing the work of a product manager. But but that really kind of set me on this path of just product management in general. And that idea of, I think Marty Kagan, you have all of his books behind you right there. Like he talks a lot about this idea of like customer obsession, which I totally agree with. And then I would say like, how we make sure the team is making good decisions. How do we embrace the uncertainty of the world? And how do we do a good job of communicating and aligning the team, right? Those are things that I think I really enjoy and love. And as I've kind of progressed through my career, I've started to alternate back and forth between, say, product management positions and product operations positions, because I see product operations really as like PMing the PM experience. I think I was maybe the first person to coin it that way. But
Mm-hmm.
why that's valuable is that actually my product in this case is the organization. It's the community of practice. It's the individualized product manager experiences. And so I see all of the things that I learned and have kind of gained experience and skills in around product management as being applied to the way that product managers do their work. And so that's maybe kind of brought us to now, at least as far as my journey.
Yeah.
But it's a lot of weird things. Like if you go and look at my LinkedIn, it doesn't really make a lot of sense other than the fact that I've just like been in the Bay Area for a very long time and other places doing like weird tech stuff, basically. So.
Well, I guess with everything that I heard, I can make a quick summary that a good product manager is a combination of another 10 or 15 different roles, right? Like kind
Well,
of like
yeah, I guess that's like an interesting way to put it, especially like the Martin's like kind of Venn diagram that we end up seeing everywhere about product management being between like business, technology, and design a lot of the times. And so I've started to like talk about this. Like I just did a kind of 3-hour session with Epic, which is the ethnography conference, about kind of a workshop. It was kind of partial workshop, mostly discussion about like what is product management, so that ethnographers, user researchers can understand how to help product managers more, right? And I guess what I keep on saying in those types of contexts is it's not just these three things, but it's like we actually need to bring all of these different cross-functional groups together to be able to make good trade-offs and decisions as a product manager. And I think of it as like not necessarily like risk reduction, like project management, TPMing, those types of things, which are really valuable in that idea of like risk reduction, making sure there's repeatability of process, things like that. But I think it's like, how do we like push innovation? How do we push on the trade-offs? And while I have experience in a lot of different domains, I still trust in those domain experts that are part of my team. So, I believe a lot in qualitative user research, but and even though I give talks on qualitative user research for PMs, like if I have a qualitative user researcher that's on my team, I leverage them as much as I can because they are the experts in this thing. Now, it doesn't mean that I don't use kind of common language that we might use. So like maybe a good example, like just honing in on, say, user research, right? Like user researchers are really great at helping us answer really open-ended questions and very specific questions. And depending on the type of question, they use different types of research. And so I would not necessarily tell them to do a particular type of research for a question I had, but I would pose the question I really want to have answered. I would say, is there a way for us to understand this? And then I would say, here's like analogies that I think of. Here's other places that people do this type of thing. And that ends up being really helpful for them. But they can then say like, I think we should do like a contextual inquiry project, which is going and observing someone in their context, right? And I would then say also, I think here's the contexts that are most interesting to me. So being able to speak that language, I think, is helpful for product managers, but we're not always the expert. Like legal is a great example of where things are constantly evolving when it comes to the patchwork of, say, privacy regulation, right? And I really came up against this at like Facebook Reality Labs when we were trying to do biometric recognition for the Portal device. Like there was a lot of issues that Facebook had with doing facial recognition, right? So we had to like bring in a lot of experts that were really well versed in the legal repercussions of risk around these things. And while I started to learn their language a little bit more, it was still them as experts. And so we would talk about the trade-offs there. So I think that's what's really important is like, I wouldn't say necessarily I'm an expert in all these like 15 or N domains that we want to include here, but I try to at least build a common language with them. And sometimes it's a language that's closer to the customer, which I think is ideal. But other times it's about me learning some of the terminology for their domain as well, to be able to then, like when I was doing business development, a lot of the time when I'd work with legal, it was slightly different. It was more about like contractual terms. Like, are these contractual terms good or bad? And so we started to build an understanding that here's a template that we are accepting, and then here's common requests. And then some of those requests are acceptable, some of them are not, right? And so again, like you build kind of expertise when working with these different domains of practice as well. So anyways, I do think that like there is a place for highly specialized PMs, but I found that people that are more generalists tend to be able to have all these different cross-functional conversations much easier, right? From a
Yeah.
product management perspective.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. The ability to delegate and the ability to just organize the group of people around you and around the product and have them march into the goal and
Yeah,
deliver user value. I think those are the best qualities or the good qualities the product manager should have.
that's
But
right.
if they have expertise in a specific field, that's fine. That's
That's right.
good. Yeah,
Yeah, and
yeah.
sometimes like when we talk about like marching towards a goal, like there's a time and a place for being efficient about that. Like we feel like we have all the
Mm-hmm,
information we need or evidence that something is right, and so we should just like execute as fast as possible to get it out there. But there's also times where I think product managers should be, when we talk about like embracing or managing uncertainty for the team, it also could mean that we're like putting off a decision until the last possible moment, or we're building experimentation to build evidence around something. And so I think it's like, product management is a lot about making the right product decision, and that
mm-hmm,
rightness is really, really subjective. And so that's why intuition is so important in product management. That's why like tacit knowledge, in the sense of like how do people build tacit knowledge through their career, through experience, like that's
mm-hmm,
something I constantly think about when we talk about like not only how do we help build better cohesion between teams, but how do we help like more junior employees gain expertise from the people that are more senior around them. And I've done things like decision forcing cases, which is kind of like a type of case study that builds expertise that comes from the U.S. Marine Corps, but actually is from like the naturalistic decision-making community around expertise transfer. And so there's all these types of things that I think a lot about, like how my role almost as a product operations person ends up overlapping, not necessarily like in the traditional sense of a product manager, it's like engineering, design, legal, safety, security, privacy, etc. Right? But it's like organizational design, HR, learning and development. And so there's like the tools that I start to think of as like a product ops person. So there's also like this interesting thing about like the domain that you're in ends up requiring different cross-functional people too. So that's very interesting to me from a difference between, say, product management and product ops.
Yeah, that was kind of my question was, so you're describing your role as PM and the PM experience,
Yeah,
and how is it really different from
yeah,
normal product management, and why is it important to even have such a role in organization?
yeah. I mean, I think like the main difference is really the customer, in my opinion. So like the
Hmm.
customer to me is a PM, right? And sometimes it's actually the leaders, right? So this is an ongoing discussion inside of like GitHub, especially for our role. It's called portfolio operations, which rather than like they've taken usually an approach of more centralized product operations teams around like releases, feedback, like a bunch of those types of things.
Hmm.
Ours is more embedded with particular senior leaders for a particular group of product managers. And so
Hmm.
we've been kind of thinking about and playing with this idea of like, is it the VP or the senior director that's our main customer, or is it the product manager that's on that team? And we kind of trade off depending on what the thing is that we're working on. But I think the
Hmm.
customer itself, like the end customer, like in case of GitHub, all of the product managers I work with should be obsessed with our customer, which is developers and development teams, right? I
Yeah.
am not as obsessed with them. They're like a third or fourth or fifth type of like customer to me. They're
Hmm.
a couple of layers of people that I need to make sure are being like helped before I get to the end developer. And so that's, I think,
Yeah.
one of the things is like this incentivization of thinking about the way the work is done rather than achieving whatever we can for the end customer. So I think that's like a key differentiator. And I think if I were to then take on what is the end customer as my customer, I think this is where product operations ends up doing a lot of the bullshit work that PMs don't want to do. And so I think that's a
Hmm.
bad pattern, because like just because something is happening where product managers don't have enough resources, that product ops should do it. I think that's fine, like we're here to help. But if it's something that is going to happen for forever, like we should hire another product manager, right? Or we should change the systems that are causing that bullshit work to happen. And so that's where I
Yeah.
kind of see this difference, right? Is like the moment I become customer obsessed with like the end customer, I think it changes the incentives for my type of role, which don't allow me to be as effective. And I think this is where the future of this is going, is that there's lots of different types of ops roles. Like, you originally, this kind of came from like financial ops or like operations from a service standpoint, like a manager of an actual like place, right?
Hmm.
COOs, that type of thing. But there's also like DevOps, there's research ops, there's design ops, there's product ops. And so I think what this is all pointing to, though, is that eventually right now we're talking about how do we improve this practice. But I think overall there should be a cross-functional team longer term that includes all of these different ops plus HR, at least the parts of HR that I think are supposed to be helpful to people rather than like protecting the company. We need to be like one group that really thinks about organizational dynamics and builds things, and not in a way that is like today. I've seen a lot of internal teams that end up doing tooling. They try to do this type of thing, but they end up just being like order takers, I'd say a majority of the time, from internal teams to just build it the way that that person wants. When the reality is like, that's like building a product for one person, right? You would not do that as a product manager. You would think about what is this balance between kind of generalization to maximize the possibility of TAM for something like that versus this idea of like building one product for one person. This is like same thing for like startups where they have like one major customer. They try to actually diversify their customers because otherwise they're building for that customer as like a professional services organization. So I think there's something really interesting there about that, which internal teams should have more agency to be able to say that, like, actually, this is not the right way to do things. And so I've been starting to become like very intimately aware of this inside of GitHub too, not only from a product perspective, but I recently took over like the lead responsible AI champ role for GitHub. And so there's a lot of interesting things about the way that we not only work in compliance, which is more about like, do we have the documentation for this type of thing versus this idea of how do we look forward and what is like truly responsible AI in the domains that GitHub works in. And so that's a very interesting problem because we have to balance this kind of like compliance aspect of it, which is in some cases legally required versus this idea of like, how do we actually help PMs make better responsible AI decisions in general, which actually may be in kind of like conflict or tension with each other sometimes. So again, that's a very interesting thing, but it kind of is another kind of layer to this thing is how we build internal tools and process and compliance and stuff like that.
Yeah. So I actually never heard before about this product operations role, which is very interesting. I think it is like...
Well, Marty Kagan says that it's not a real role and he worries about it being like a very process oriented role. So I've talked to him a couple times in person. He's a very nice person. But I think like there's been like kind of this battle between him and Melissa Perry and Denise Tiles about the way they think about the value of product operations. I think in the end, like we all want to make sure that product teams are doing the most effective thing possible. And I think everybody will agree about that. I think the way we go about it is where there's like some nuance around this.
Yeah, and it seems like it's an enabling role and maybe teaching them or maybe putting some processes in place, even though these days not necessarily everybody liked that word.
Or removing process, by the way. One thing we forget about this is that like if you can't remember why a process exists and like what are the benefits of that process, it probably means that the process is no longer valuable and it's just there for like bureaucracy's sake. And so that's where I think product ops people come in is we can say like, should we dismantle this or reassess the goals of this process? And so, I mean, this is just like one of those weird things, but for like inside my role, like I've been starting to rethink like what is the documentation that I create, kind of like a PRD or a specification for doing this type of thing. And we're starting to like settle on a format that I think is valuable. And it's not wholly different than a PRD, but it's like different in the way that we like specify the way that people and teams and technologies interact in this case to be able to talk about and even things like enablement, right? Like we think much more about enablement, I think, than the average product manager about how does someone adopt this. And then we need to think about like mental overhead and work in progress for PMs and how does this impact like their cadence. So there's all these things that we start to think about in a slightly different way that is nuanced for the way that like teams adapt change or remove processes in ways that are no longer helpful.
Yeah, and I guess it also becomes more or less standard across the organization, right? Because in old days, each product manager may be driving their teams in their own way. And now you have some like central
sometimes
person.
I mean, I think that's like a very interesting point, right? Is that like there are some things that are good for a team to kind of build in a grassroots way that is specific to their team and their context and the things they need to get done, even the personalities of the team. And so there's value in that. And so they're like, that's maybe one of the things that I try to put into all of these things is that there are potential aspects of this new process that we don't want to specify, and we want to let every team decide the way that they end up doing this, right? But there are key things. The reason why we either adopt a process for one part of the org or across the entire org is like, where are there efficiencies in reducing or removing tensions or gaps between things? versus this and alignment versus like sometimes actually having siloing in between teams is valuable, because if you have siloing, that means you have less dependencies ideally, and that every team can rush forward, right? And there's value for that. But there are other times where, like, if you're trying to create like end-to-end products that are really kind of valuable to a customer end-to-end, you want less siloing and you want more dependency building. And so it kind of depends on the type of thing you're building and where you're at with that stage and all these things. And that's why, like, I think being more aware of that means that as a product operations person that is more focused on the complexity of organizations, means you will not build all up processes for every single thing, that you will actually allow for effectively like sense making of that PM in their context with their cross-functional team versus sense making that we do as product operations people, which is how are they doing their work and situating it within the larger organization in some way. So there's value of both.
Yeah.
And I always want to just make sure that's clear. Is that's why I keep on saying, like, it's not only dismantling, but it's like, you know, organization is fractal in the way that it works, and that like at higher levels, there's rougher versions of this versus at lower levels, there's rougher versions. I mean, I just LinkedIn. I don't use Twitter as much as I used to, or X or whatever, but I just LinkedIn about this. Like, I was reading about this post about kind of computation and what is computation and like computational thinking. And it harkened me back to my days of like doing O notation and learning what that was, right? Which is all about this idea of like complexity and kind of resource usage of a particular algorithm. And it started to make me think about like this work in progress limit that people have for change, right? And like people can't be changing their process every single week. They'll get burnt out by that amount of change, right? And so then it made me think about, from the fractalness of this, like, say we have a new strategic kind of process that is about how do we build roadmaps, for example. What is the impact actually of updating that roadmap all the time? And how does that impact all the individuals when you have to fan out the work that comes out of that? And I started thinking about, like, is there a version of this type of O notation for the way that like organizational dynamics and design ends up doing things? And I don't have a good answer for that. It's just like this type of analogy and cross-domain thinking is something I try to bring to my practice in some ways. So yeah, that was something that's just like a thought today that's been like kind of eating up some cycles in my head. So
yeah, that's great. I think that's a very interesting and good point, that each organization should look at which process to adapt, which process to eliminate, because it's unique to their business, to their industry, to their people and team and culture and all these different variables.
That's right.
We can't just take some process that works somewhere else, apply it, and hope for miracle. So
that's a good example of this is like everybody talking about pizza size, 2 pizza teams, and the idea of working backwards, and the idea of pure FAQs and weekly metrics reviews, like all that Amazon stuff. Like, it works for Amazon because they have, you know, again, like you can say like, has it drifted or not? And there's different major areas of Amazon, but like there was a lot of cultural influence that was created through like incentivization and punishment and like who you hired and how all these meetings were happening with Jeff Bezos and stuff like that, that created the cultural environment that allowed for these things to work. Now, it doesn't mean that these things can't work elsewhere, but if you're just like, oh, the answer to everything is a 2 pizza team because it worked for Amazon, that's the wrong way to think about it, right? Like you're not adapting it for your cultural needs or context, essentially.
Yeah.
And culture is also emergent, right? Like, we keep on talking about culture a lot of time as if we can just like tweak culture a little bit, but culture is emergent out of like what is actually considered to be successful here. The only things that like leaders actually have ownership over is their own behavior, right? How do they incentivize things or punish things? How do they hire people? And then what do they set as goals, right? All of that turns into what people consider to be success or failure at an org, which is basically the emergent thing we call culture, essentially.
Yeah, that's a great point. So let's talk about qualities for a good product manager and qualities for a good product team. What would be your thoughts about that?
I mean, I do think that kind of in general, there's a lot about kind of keeping the decision-making cycle moving as appropriate, or time boxing it, and kind of like, how do we make sure decisions are being made in a way that are helpful? So I think like being able to communicate is very, very important, right? Like being able to do that in a bunch of different modalities. So that means like one-on-one conversations, group facilitation of a decision meeting, the idea of like writing documents or briefs, async comm, like through Slack and email and that type of stuff. So those are all things that I think like the better that PMs are at that, I think the more successful they're likely to be, just because they're getting across their point and their question and all that type of stuff. I would also say that I think being very open-minded a lot of the time, because and like maybe the idea of like over-indexing on growth mindset when it comes to being a PM, because you're not going to be the expert in a lot of things other than being a PM. And so in those particular cases, like I've worked with, occasionally like engineering, either leaders or engineers that are just like incredibly difficult to get along with. And they're just kind of jerks, right? And they constantly make you feel bad for the way that you are asking questions or trying to understand what they're doing. And like, honestly, I wish we didn't have to work with people like that, but it happens every now and then. And sometimes it's a communication style issue. Sometimes it's just like a poor interpersonal skills issue. And sometimes it's because like they're rewarded for other things than actually being like part of a team and having team cohesion. And so I think like trying to do a better job of like looking at feedback or communication back as something that we like. Thank you for the feedback is a really great book, because it helped me understand that I can accept like someone else's point of view and I can think about it, but it doesn't mean I have to change because of that. Like that's actually probably the most powerful growth mindset, is that like you should always be open to getting feedback from people, and they may not deliver it in a way that is very helpful, and they may not do it in a timely manner, but you should always be trying to learn from other people. And then from there, you can decide whether it's more of a taste thing. Like your job is not there to do things the way everybody else wants you to do them. Your job is to make the best product possible. And so that's where I think there's something about this like kind of, and again, I think there's a lot of like paradoxical things inside of like product management, like, but yeah, having an open mind to and a growth like mindset of learning things, but then also like being and figuring out what is like really great product management practice look like inside your context. Those can both exist at the same time, and they don't always have to agree, and that's okay, right? Like that's totally fine. And then the last thing, I think, like anybody who is like overly certain about something, like I've dealt with this mindset an awful lot inside of different organizations, but like especially in places where there's a lot of smart people, people are very sure of what they're doing, and I think I'm always questioning whether the thing I'm doing is the best thing possible right now, and it's not necessarily. I wouldn't call it like imposter syndrome necessarily. I mean, I there is something like that in the back of my head, is like, is this the best way to do this? But it's because I'm constantly just trying to understand, like, what is it I don't know about right now? Like, I would say, if anything, my motto is like, I am wrong today, I just don't know how yet. And so from that perspective, I think the embracing of that type of mindset is really good for product managers, usually because it means that they can constantly be learning from the environment. They can be constantly discovering new things. Now, again, the paradox here is that we also need to be confident in the way that we end up interacting with people. And so there's like this difference between being curious, taking a stance of curiosity, versus like just being steamrolled by everybody. And so I think there's something there about that too. So those are all things that I think like help product managers be better at their role. But I've, again, like there have been lots of product managers that are very successful inside of like say large organization, because they're just so confident and they are so sure that they're right. Now, it doesn't mean that they don't fail eventually. Like there's a lot of like, I think, worry that I have that the people that have made it to like very senior positions have kind of like been lucky enough that they haven't failed yet. And so they seem like they're right. They're very certain, and they seem like they're right because they're at a place of success, but that's called survivorship bias, right? And that they're actually there because everybody else that was around them ended up failing. It's just that they were the ones that happened to lotto into that right place. And so there's a balance here. Like there's definitely people that are very talented that are leaders, right? Like I'm not going to say
or maybe they failed earlier in their career and they learned from that.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Like Steve Jobs is a great example where everybody points to someone that is incredibly confident about something, but he's failed many different ways, right? Like, but he is very customer obsessed, very, very influential in the way that he would run his organization, had a very high bar for kind of like taste in the way that things were done. But he's also a real asshole to everybody that he worked with. And some people jived in that worked in that type of environment, others didn't, right? So, but he's an example of where like Next is a great example of where he like failed, right? So that's what I'd say is like, I think that is something I see a lot of the time inside of these large organizations, is that people that are very certain. Now, the problem with this too is that it makes my job really hard as a product ops person when someone is very certain, because more often than not, being really good as a leader means that you also need to change as a leader. Most of the time, whatever you want inside that organization, it doesn't always happen, but at least you can like push people to do a new process that you want. And it may mean that like they will still do it, because if they don't do it, they'll get fired or they'll get penalized or something like that. And you'll either have people like leaving the team because they don't believe in the way that you want to do things, or they'll create shadow systems that actually get the work done. But more often than not, my biggest issue is actually making change in the leaders I work with. And that's hard for leaders that have been successful a lot in the past. They've been rewarded a lot in the past. They're very certain about the way they do things. Those are the hardest people to change, because they're at this point, and it's called like dominant logic theory. If you want to look up there's like a paper from like a 1980s management science. And I met one of the authors like a while ago about this, but like there's a real issue with kind of people that have been so successful. They believe that their past mental models that they're very certain about should be applied to current situations, but the environment may have been different. And so they're stuck in this kind of like trap of that they feel like they need to do things a certain way when maybe they should be doing them differently. So I'd say that's my hardest job, is actually dealing with leaders that are very certain about the work they do.
That's very interesting what you just said, because I have this analogy in my head. I'm working in the government organization with a lot of scientists, and all of them are really, really smart people.
Yeah.
And whether you're really successful or whether you're really smart, it's really hard to break through and try to either motivate you or change your behavior a little bit and things like that. It's really, really hard. And I can really relate there with what you just said.
And there's something to be said for people that are incredibly stubborn, right? Like there are things that get done by being stubborn, right? But we also start to see that like there's stubbornness that's like successful stubbornness in some ways, right? Like this person has made it up through the ranks. Maybe their stubbornness has gotten them there. But then there's all these stories about people that are stubborn in a very unsuccessful way for a very long time. But then we find that actually they were right? Like, and I say this in like a scientific standpoint, like people stuff is harder to do. Like it's not as straightforward, I think, in some ways as scientific stuff. So it's like the idea of like the person that discovered about like blood flow to tumors, right? Or the people that discovered like how ulcers were bacterial, or mRNA vaccines. These are all examples of people that have toiled for decades. And actually even the idea of like the person who, I'm blanking on his name right now, that like was convinced that washing your hands would like decrease mortality inside of places. Like I'm blanking on his name right now. But he died basically like in an insane asylum because no one believed him that this was true, right? But he probably was like a major change in the way medical science was understood, right? So I would just say like, we need to be open to this kind of like the weirdos and the hotspots of success in different places. And that's really hard to do when you're very, very certain about things. And so maybe that's my job. Maybe my mission overall, like I would say my mission, like my multi-year mission, is to get people to consider uncertainty more and to embrace it more. Because I think like some of the worst things that happen in this world are because of people's certainty about other people, about the situation, about what is right. And so that's where, I don't know, I think that's like a very interesting thing. And so I would just say like, that gets back to leaders, right? Like any leader that is so certain that you can never change them, it's not actually worthwhile to have someone like me as a product ops person, because part of my job is actually changing the leaders to adapt to the team, and not just the team adapt to the leader, right? Which I think is a lot of what like traditional disagreements with product ops as a role is about, is that you're just there to be the hatchet man for the leader to like force the new status reporting format on the rest of the team. And if you just do that, if it's not a two-way street, then I think that product ops is actually just some type of process police. And that's not how I do my practice. And that's not how GitHub asked me to do my practice, by the way. But like, I think I've seen that every now and then. And that's where I think like my job is not effective if I can't get some change from the leaders that I work with too.
Yeah, it also probably requires a lot of psychology, and not in a way like to manipulate people, but to really understand where they're coming from and help them out and help push through some doors and things like that. Yeah,
that's right. And I would say like there's a lot about kind of just understanding the way that people make decisions. And again, biases are there because of the fact that we have limited information, we have limited time, we have limited resources. And so that's why biases exist. But there's other types of biases too. Like there's, I was just reading through this paper that I can send you a link to, but it was all about like how humans make stupid decisions in groups. And he's using inflammatory language on purpose, but like the way that we get out of that is that there's like this weird kind of middle ground that we need to find between all of the individual biases that we have, which cause us to not make good decisions as individuals, because we're not paying attention to all the information that's available that we should, right? Versus this idea of like how we get into groupthink as groups, right? So there's like a book by, I think it's Cavalletti. It's like Power in Crowds, which was like from the 50s. And it's all about this like idea of like the mob mentality. And the reason why people end up really doing this type of thing is because we're social animals. We don't want to be outcasts. And so there's like both sides of this cause problems for decision making. And so the problem is that like as a product ops person, I'd say product managers need to understand this too when it comes to like adoption of their product. We need to understand both sides of that kind of equation. And it's not even an equation. It's more of just like, it's a very with soft system methodology and like complex systems type of thinking. We'll just think about this as like, it's just like a wicked system that we need to deal with. And we need to constantly adjust and understand what's going on. And I mean, a great example of this is that when I was at Microsoft, like the first time, I guess I'm now technically there a second time with GitHub. But when I was there the first time, like the people in Office would talk about how like the biggest competitor is not like at the time is not Lotus Notes or something like that, or Star Office or something like that. It was like the last version of Office is the biggest competitor because people don't want to change. They don't want to adopt new things. IT doesn't want to roll out new software. And so that points to the fact that like for product operations people, right, our big job is actually enablement of new process. Like part of it is designing the process, but the real thing is getting people to do the new process for the right reasons. And I look at like whenever, like if I'm getting my posts ignored or people are not complying with the new process, I don't see it as like I need to do a better job of just like bothering people all the time. That could be part of it. But it really is like there's something about this process that is not syncing or fitting with the way they do their work day to day. And so I look at that engagement as actually that it is fit for them or not. Right. And it may be that just like they're dealing with too much stuff. And that's a slightly different issue than just what I do as a product ops person. But it points to these issues that maybe they're overburdened with other processes today, or they have too much work, or they're owning too many products. So they're kind of like context switching all the time. So I use that as like a signal, not necessarily as like, hey, I just need to like turn the screws harder on these PMs to adopt this process. But it's like, I need to help them maybe in a different way than what I'm doing right now. Maybe it's just not the right product from my perspective. Right.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, there are many different ways how to influence on people, and if they're busy, they not pay full attention, and they ignore stuff. So that's not good. Yeah. So I wanted to ask you about the iCertainty project that you're running or co-funded. So what motivated you to start it, and what are you doing with that company or organization?
Yeah. So the reason why, so Kyle and John first started doing this as part of kind of thinking a lot about decision making, and Dot.work, which I'm also an advisor for, is a startup that thinks a lot about kind of like how do we track and understand decision making inside of organizations. But the Uncertainty Project was something that we co-founded together essentially as a community, focused on really decision making and strategy and the way that we end up doing that type of thing. And so it really started kind of like as a newsletter at first. And so there's a bunch of different tools that you can find there about different ways of making decisions, models for that. I mean, I think some of the things that I've written there are kind of like, how do I use like randomness in decision making to help make decisions more robust? Things like, how do we do things like decision rehearsals, which is basically like wargaming for the way that we understand things. I've written a lot of posts about kind of the meta stages of decision making. How do we kind of separate things like the decision itself from the discourse of the decision? I've even talked about the idea of like how will virtual agents or agentive technologies, as we talk about it today, will actually impact decision making in the future. And so it's kind of a place for me to, I think, explore a lot of these thoughts, but also to try to build some like base kind of resources for how people should make decisions better inside of organizations. I mean, more recently, we now have like a Slack channel that's very small, but like with some of the people that are interested in talking more about decision making. We've been doing some workshops about like, I've been wondering an awful lot recently about how we visualize decisions, and not only visualize them, but commemorize them and create like artifacts longer term, so that people can learn from those decisions, either from a thematic sense or from a, are the assumptions underlying this decision still valuable? And so should we rethink this decision or not? Because I see a lot of orgs spinning their wheels on constantly relitigating decisions that were already made, and the assumptions haven't changed other than someone's opinion. And so I think there's some interesting things there that we start to talk about, what is the landscape, and was very inspired by this. I've just been enamored with this concept of the memory palace, which I've heard of a long time ago, but as applied to this idea of how do I internalize the lesson of a decision as someone that wasn't part of that decision, I think is a really key aspect of the future of how we actually manage decisions inside of organizations. So there's a place, again, very exploratory for me, but also to find like-minded people that want to talk about this type of stuff. And so, yeah, that's the Uncertainty Project. But it's really interesting. It's a newsletter. I definitely recommend you subscribe to it. I think we have close to 2,000 or so subscribers. Try to put out something every week, and John's been doing a great job doing that recently. My stuff is more weird and experimental, so it's not as frequent as John's stuff. But I definitely try to post there every now and then too. Yeah. And then we do workshops and things. But I think there's something interesting, longer term, just how do we help people in general do a more rigorous or better job, a more effective job at decision making inside of a lot of different contexts.
Yeah, I think I will subscribe for sure, because my master's degree is in decision support systems.
Oh, cool. Yeah, very cool.
Actually, automating it, but it's mostly for business purpose,
yeah, fair enough.
Business intelligence stuff and analytics, early stage of artificial intelligence and things like that. But yeah, that's definitely something interesting.
Cool. And I think one thing I've pulled, I've done a lot of, when I think a lot about AI and machine learning, I think about it more from an HCI standpoint. And so a very important paper, which I don't know if you came across in your studies, but Paris Surman's, trust and automation, use, disuse, misuse, and abuse is one of those papers that is just so foundational about how do we set up the right levels of trust with a technology so that people can either disagree with it or agree with it or disable it or whatever. And so I think there's so much for us to learn, especially for the way things are working today with agentic technology. I've been doing a lot of talks recently about what does it mean to have a multi-agent system, and agent is kind of this new hyped up moniker when the reality is what we're talking about is usually assistive or automative technologies. But what is agentic and how does that actually fit within human teaming, I think is an amazing and interesting thing to talk about. But we can get caught up on what is agentic or not as a terminology and a definition. I think I've been struggling with that type of philosophical thing in my head for the last couple months, just trying to justify all of the hype around the terminology and the moniker of agentive and agentic technologies, basically. So it's very interesting. And so, I think decision-making and all these models that we talk about from the Uncertainty Project as decision-making, inside of that, how will better automated systems enable humans to make the better decision? How does it set up the discourse for better decision-making? How does it identify that a decision needs to be made by a wider group of people automatically? And then how do we start to learn through feedback systems on this? Here's a theme of decision making that we keep on coming across that causes a lot of problems. This sounds like this should be a strategic question that leaders answer and then provides an easier way for people to make decisions in the future, right? Those are all things that especially with the newest kind of just large language models and in general, this idea of translation from anything to anything type of stuff maybe gets a little bit easier because the tripwires that we used to have were very analytically focused, right? But now we can start to say, rather than just Google alerts, tell me whenever there's a keyword in this industry and gets you a bunch of garbage. It's there's something more about the way that I can actually provide context and prompt or a prompt engineering or type of thing to say here's the thing that I'm actually more interested in. And so give me more of that information. Right. And so there's some amazing things that are going to be coming out soon around this and I think internal to GitHub, I'm working an awful lot on how do we do a better job of meeting summarization automatically using a transcript? And some of the meeting summarization services are not bad, but they also miss a lot of context. So what are the prompts we should be creating, do a better job of creating a succinct version of this meeting for people that were not there that then need to be decision makers based off of the thing that was covered, right? That's a really interesting question and problem in some way. So
I think with all the decision making tools and frameworks and everything, input is also very important. which questions you ask, where you're coming from, those type things, because
That's right.
that becomes like your thing that you're working with, where you're starting with. And if that's not the right question or not the right information that you're getting, then after that it's all false. So yeah. So another thing I wanted to ask you is about meetings. Just in general,
Yeah.
in the organization. What is your take on it?
Yeah. I mean, I'm doing a talk at Agile Alliance this year that's called basically "Meetings Are Good," actually. And I think that meetings have gotten really a bad rap. And the reason why is that people feel like it's one of the biggest productivity um, problems that people have is being in too many meetings. And I think it's intimately related to the way that decisions are made inside of organizations. And so
Hmm.
I think there's a really great book that I've read that like is called The Enigma of Reason, and they try to make a case that communication is actually for discourse of reasoning rather than internal to our heads. Even though Kahneman would say that there's like system one and two thinking, and system two thinking is maybe more about like this deliberative logical process potentially rather than kind of not necessarily heuristic, but maybe a Bayesian way of like calculating what is the thing I should be doing. Like
Hmm.
this group or these authors talk about the fact that like actually the reason why we talk to each other is to do a couple key things. One of them is to understand what norms are at play right now, right? So
Hmm.
right now we're in the norm of a podcast, so I'm going to talk a very particular way, probably going to like talk a lot more than I would have otherwise if we were in a regular conversation, because like it's going to be less about back and forth because you're interviewing me and a bunch of stuff like that. So there's norms that are at play in this conversation.
Hmm.
But then it's also like when we have a really good conversation, it's about how do we start to build better mental models of what each other actually thinks or believes. And then decision making is actually something after that, which is about power. It's about all these other things like this person is actually the decision maker, or we have to agree because that's the norm of the way we make decisions, a bunch of stuff like that. But I think like when it comes to meetings, right, and the thing that I think is really valuable here, and what I'm going to talk about at Agile Alliance is really just about like if we take this approach that it's all about establishing norms and mind reading is the term of the author, and not in an ESP way, but like through discourse we learn about what each other cares about, right?
Hmm.
If we focus on those times for meetings, it means we get rid of a lot of meetings that are actually bad for us, like status reporting or going around the room and just talking about whatever we want type of meetings. Problem is that
Hmm.
that's the easiest thing to do. It requires little to no prep. It's just the way people do things, quote unquote, right? And so they just sleepwalk through the creation of these meetings, which then creates basically it's like a tragedy. It's almost like a tragedy that commons for attention, right? Is probably the best way to put it because there's no one really thinks about this, so everybody thinks that like everybody's attention is theirs to take. And the reason why they do that, and they see that is because people in power when it's they don't attend meetings that they don't think are valuable, right? They would prefer to have a meeting where they're the ones in control of the agenda. They control the entire topic flow because they just want information or they want to tell you something or they want to make a decision with and again, there's like a bunch of stuff like that. But then
Yeah.
people see that those people in power doing it that way, and so then we create basically the equivalent of a traffic jam because everybody thinks that they need to go when it's their time to go somewhere. It's like I use that example like of the fact that like you're not stuck in traffic, you are traffic, and I think it's a really good example of the fact that we are the reason why meetings are bad. And so I would just say that like I think there's a real value for good discourse and really good kind of creation of understanding between people. But we can use async tools for a lot of this other stuff that doesn't meet those kind of things of socio-technical systems where we're trying to understand the norms in a more nuanced way or trying to actually like mind read each other. Shouldn't have meetings in those cases. And so
Yeah.
that's my argument at least. And I'm also like putting together a game right now which is more like a role-playing game that I think we're tentatively calling it agenda just because it has a double
Mm.
entendre about like meeting agenda and personal agenda. And it's
Hmm.
basically this like weird role-playing game about meetings. And so everybody has some stats in the meeting, they have action points, and then we basically role play out a meeting, different formats, different goals, and then different kind of personal agendas inside those meetings. And so like if anybody's ever done like six thinking hats inside of a meeting, it's kind of like that, but to like some weird like role play improv version of that. And so I think there's something really interesting about just like we should be experimenting more with meeting types as product ops people. I try to constantly frame like experiments in different ways of doing things. And so I think it's like really valuable for organizations to think about this. And so Part of the talk during Agile Alliance, I'll also just talk about like how I decide what would be valuable in, say, like a team summit that goes over the course of like a couple days, and kind of how do we decide like the input and output of meetings and situate that inside of like the larger organization. So just in general, like I believe there is like a real value to having conversations. And
Mm-hmm.
if we are not always clear about why we're doing that, I think we end up getting to this place where just everybody's in 9 to 5 meetings and they have to do their work later at night. And that shouldn't be the way things are. Like you should be able to actually do deeper thought from a product management perspective. You should be reading things that are outside your organization. Because that's
Yeah.
another problem I see is like people become so insular when all they see is really just the organization that they're in working rather than seeing how that might compare somewhere else. So anyways, I just think meetings are good actually. And that's what I would argue.
Yeah, yeah. The meetings that are not good are actually the ones that don't produce any action items or decisions, right?
That's right. Yeah, and they don't
Yeah,
allow for true discourse, right? Like the idea that
yeah.
maybe one of the worst, not the worst meeting, but like a bad meeting that's out there is the group PM meeting. And what that is the group PM gets in front of X number of like directs or skip level directs and just talks to them for 30 minutes about the hand down. And what they should have
Hmm.
done is they should have just like written that down as a memo, probably. What people
Yeah.
should be doing in that meeting is learning how that senior leader actually does their work, right? And
Hmm.
so that's not actually just, it's not even just the idea of here's what we're doing, here's what I believe, but it's like, here's the decision making process for this thing and Q&A around that. Or like, I even think that this idea of just like playing games or doing case studies together ends up helping you learn so much about that senior leader. And I would much rather that we have like a role, like a strategic rehearsal about the strategy that we're applying and how it might go in the future and the way that senior leader would make decisions based on some uncertainty in the future, right? I would much rather learn that from the senior leader than just hear them give me hand downs that are basically status, right? And
Yeah.
so I think that's an example of where like power has created certain types of meetings that are good for the leader, but not good for everybody else. And so, you know, that's I think that's really what's most important here is that we're
Yeah.
trying to make it so that these meetings are valuable for everybody that's in them. And if they're not valuable for everybody, they shouldn't be in them, right?
Yeah. Yeah. If I think about analogy with Scrum meetings, for example, actually some of them are not even called meetings; they're called activities. Like for
Yeah,
example,
fair enough.
refinement.
Yeah,
When team gathers together and they're working on ticket by ticket or requirement by requirement, figuring out what and how to do. So those activities actually are really valuable, right? They produce a lot
yeah,
of decisions, and people actually know what to do after that. But I agree, most meetings are just like, and people refuse to cancel them. Like, oh no, let's meet, let's just talk about something, we'll come up, open agenda, come with whatever, and it's waste of time.
yeah, yeah,
So,
totally.
yeah,
Yeah, and that's right.
yeah,
Like, I mean, I think this idea of like rituals or activities is valuable in a lot of ways because it forces you through some like cadence to do some active, like something over time, right? Like you should do refinement on a regular basis, ideally, right?
yeah,
But
yeah,
does it always need to be a meeting? Maybe not, right? Do you always need to do it the same way? Maybe not, right? Like, so that's I think where like there's still a place for ritual. I've been thinking and reading a lot more about like experience design and kind of transformation and that type of stuff. And so I think there's something about the way that we actually fit within the human experience of doing this work. But I don't think we think about it that way usually. We think about it that we have to do this because it's part of the cadence, when the reality
hmm,
is like maybe we should be changing or trying new ways of doing this, right? Like maybe one piece of advice I give a lot of people is if you're worried about that a meeting type is actually not valuable, kind of manufacture a reason to not do that meeting the same way. So, for
hmm,
example, during holidays, right? Like it's the 4th of July is coming up right now when we're talking. Um,
hmm,
like there's a lot of meetings this week that went to async because of the fact that there was like not a lot of people around. And so that's a great opportunity to experiment with like, did this meeting just go just as well as an async documented process versus a meeting? And if that's the case, then maybe we don't need that meeting, right?
yeah, yeah,
Or like someone not showing up. Like there's the whole realm of like chaos engineering is a really interesting field, mostly from like the SRE world. But like, how do we remove people randomly and see how decision making still takes place, right? Or how do we alter this process in some way randomly that then helps us figure out, is this a valuable process or not? So I think that's something I'm constantly like wondering about. Now, sometimes this is outside like the Overton window of what is acceptable inside of organizations. People are like, why are you messing with our process like this? We could go out of business if we don't do this process the way it should be. So there's like, again, this gets back at the main thing I rally against, which is like over certainty in what we're doing. And so anyways, but you have to deal with the contextual context, like the actual cultural context of your org still. And so that's why like some of
Yeah.
this stuff is harder to do in some places than others, unfortunately.
hmm Yeah. Yeah. I can see that the corporate culture, whatever it is, and
Yeah,
it just has to be the way it is.
that's right.
Um, so, what about the future of product
Mm,
management? Do you see any trends or any? Well, we know that AI is kind of changing
sure.
everything. So maybe you can also
Yeah.
provide your opinion on that and what you see.
I mean, I think like one of the things that we should ideally see more of, and you know, and this is stuff, or I think like the things that GitHub is working on right now when it comes to not only code generation completion, but the idea of the opposite way too, where we want to start taking pieces of code and summarizing it in natural language. Um,
Mm,
I think that bidirectionality of translation from anything to anything becomes really valuable for PMs. And the reason why is like usually we would have like a PRD or a spec that there might be some mockups or prototypes that are created. There's a bunch of code that's written. Then there's like an architectural design that's written after the code is written to try to encapsulate that. And then there's like a bunch of iteration that's happening across all these things, and all of them are out of date with each other. And so, what I wonder is this idea of this type of technology being a connector where it's able to do the translation from these different things and try to detect when there's like a discrepancy. And if there is a discrepancy, that is a really important trade-off discussion to have. And if it's something that's very simple, that's like in the code, it was written this way, and that has the impact on this type of like customer impact or the architecture impact, which impacts like privacy or security, like we should then talk about that thing rather than discovering it through some type of like many meeting process or being caught by it when we go out into the wild. So I think that's one way the product management, like the future of it, will be changing. I also, I think this role of being kind of an arbitrator of decision making and trade off, I think is still valuable. But I think there's a lot of pressures right now from other types of fields like product design, the idea of like managers or senior leaders, engineering managers, like can those people do the product manager job or not? I think there needs to be a third part, like another party that is building tension between these cross-functional teams. But I
mhm,
mean, you look at there's always this like hype thing that like a PM's job isn't anything, and so everybody else can just take that job. I think we
mhm,
need to think about holistically the way we build tension between practices and between teams and between different things inside of the organization that I don't think we do a good job of right now. And so I hope in the future, and I'm trying to constantly ask about this, we do a better job of providing that tension and creating healthy tension between things to be able to make better decisions. Because that like type of diversity of perspective does actually create better products overall. Um, so I think that's like another future thing is maybe we'll be more aware of this type of tension. Um, Unfortunately, with the tightening of the job market, it feels like people are thinking about how do we like reduce the type of work that's being done and automating more of it. I don't think that's going to necessarily get the answers that people want. I do believe that a lot of these tools are more about augmentation than replacement or automation today. And so I think that's something that there's going to be a lot of fervor around how do we build more automation, but it's going to fail in ways that they don't want to fail, right? And so yeah. Anyways, I think those are kind of like some of the things that are going to be happening. I mean, I do think like gigification or replaceability of people within an organization is going to come for these types of jobs as well eventually. Um, so that's another thing. I mean, I'm working on this like weird kind of design fiction project about what would be the employee manual of the future. And so what would it mean like 5, 10, 20 years from now when you join an organization that maybe has like more robust AI agents and digital twins of you? What does it mean to like have, kind of offices that are worth going into? What does it mean to have digital async properties that are more integrated with the way we do our work and just replaceability in general of like individuals? Because everything that happens today when it comes to, job requirements interview processes, performance ladders, all performance reviews, all that stuff. It's about making you as cookie cutter as possible, so you can be replaced eventually by someone else or something else.
Yeah.
But there's that balance against now, like I, as an individual, have an embodied experience that I think is very particular. And my practice is like very individualized. And so I think that is going to be constantly something that at least I just keep thinking about and wondering about when it comes to product management too. So I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. I haven't thought about that. That everybody's talking about replacing jobs with AI and essentially building some sort of model that can replace every single, let's call it sales representative. But every sales representative does it in a different way. So
That's
do
right.
you need to have million of these models now, or just
Yeah,
one will do it? That's a
that's
very
right.
interesting question. I never thought about that.
Well, this is
Yeah.
the difference between like building something from scratch, right? Like that is for one use versus this idea of
Mm-hmm.
like personalization or customization. And then also
Right.
just like when it comes to contextual awareness, right? Those are all slightly different things. And we want to build products that are actually adapted to that person's use, but it doesn't mean that every interface is different for everybody, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like there's still things when I was working at a company called IP Soft, where we were working on something. It was like Amelia was like this kind of proto chatbot and IT kind of conversational agent. Like a lot of people would say like, well, so here's like a great skill. It can give you the account balance. Like I know how to use my banking app. You know what I mean? Like on my phone, I can go and check my bank account balance. That's not why I'm going to go to a conversational agent. I'm going to go to a conversational agent because I can't figure out how to do something that I don't usually do with this thing. So like, and then actually, I don't even want to talk to one of these chatbots if it's like a highly emotional, like I just got scammed by someone. I want to maybe
Mm-hmm.
report it through an app or talk to a chatbot to get it started, but I really need like someone's compassion and empathy towards me in this moment because it's like a highly human thing that I'm going through right now. So I kept on trying to make those like differentiations, and I think that's going to continue to be true. Is that like it's not always about like doing these like simple stupid cases with the AI. It's about when is this appropriate when I can't figure out what's going on and I need to do something, right? Versus the times I need like human care and that human to human
Mm-hmm.
connection. Now it's going to get harder and harder to tell that, and that's why phishing ends up being a bigger problem over time. But like,
Yeah.
that's more in the way that like I don't think we want to do things, right? Like I think we want to have automation when it's helpful and appropriate, but I don't want it when it's actually taking advantage of me and it's like some type of uneven power dynamic between me and the corporation. And so I don't know. I was
Yeah.
just like reading through Tech Dirt has this interesting article about like robots.txt, which is like been a thing in the tech world since like search engines started being around, where people didn't want or did want to have actually like their sites indexed in some way. And it becomes like a really interesting question from a technological standpoint is that right now agents are basically embedded inside of large organizations or corporations. But what does it mean for me to have a personal agent that I control? And so this robots.txt like ends up being like an interesting question. Like if it's my agent doing this, but it's automated, is that acceptable or not? And there's going to be a lot of interesting Supreme Court cases, especially around scraping of websites that are already happening right now, but on the individualized
Mm-hmm.
basis. I think there's like something interesting about the power dynamic between large corporations versus open source projects that I control in some way longer term. So anyways, I know we're like starting to get on our time, but like I think there's some really interesting questions longer
Yeah.
term about the way that technology is used by individuals rather than corporations.
Yeah, I just had another episode recently with somebody who's an expert in AI, and we were talking about deep fakes
Hmm.
and how people in this banking industry, for example, can
Yeah.
fake the voice and steal
Yes.
money. And he was given an interesting, not, it's kind of bad example,
Hmm.
or actually
Hmm.
some company, I think somewhere in Asia, they created the fake Zoom meeting and they talked CEO into wiring $25 million to them. And it was
Amazing.
completely deep fake. And he just lost all this money. And it's like amazing how crazy this technology is and how dangerous it
Yeah.
is. So
Yeah.
yeah, we have to be careful.
Yeah. And,
Yeah.
and I think like, like the who was it? It was actually I think it was the CEO of NVIDIA, or no, sorry, it was Zoom that was talking about how like longer term we'll just send our agents to meetings and stuff like that. And I've been starting to write like a sci-fi short story about the fact that like well, what happens if like you're the only human in that meeting? and, and so
Or if
like,
there's no humans at all.
yeah, exactly. And so like, why even have that meeting? Why not just calculate the outcome of the meeting?
Yeah.
Right. And so I
Yeah.
think there's like some interesting things about maybe we're just doing certain aspects of our work in a performative way, and that we should really be focusing on like what are the value that we end up doing in this. So I think again, there's lots of very interesting questions to answer about this stuff. But anyways, I think like we will always need people. People are the actual decision makers because we have agency and we have an actual like lived experience. And I think those
Mm-hmm.
things are most important. And
Yeah.
so that's why I think also like product management tends to index on those things higher, I think, than more mechanized processes. That's why we say it depends all the time, is we're trying to be as contextual as possible to the particular people that we're trying to be like obsessed about. And
Yeah.
so that to me is like real the future of product management, is really continuing to do this and continuing to do it in a human way, I think. But with the aids
Mm-hmm.
of all of these things, like how do we actually use the entire body of knowledge that we're collecting through customer research, customer support to constantly remind
Mm-hmm.
us and actually as a reference for how we do our work. I think we could do a better job of that. And I think these types of tools will
Mm-hmm.
help us do that.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. And okay, so yeah, we're coming to the end here. So the final question is, or rather ask, if you have any advice for something we haven't talked about yet, or in general for product managers.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say like try to try to embrace uncertainty more, right? Like try to actually see the fact that we live in highly volatile environments today, especially if you're doing anything with like AI or machine learning. It's the environment is changing so fast that like I think just getting better at how we deal with uncertainty and how we understand complex systems, how we constantly work through emergent behavior that's happening that we can't predict, right? That is a skill set I would recommend that everybody just gets better at, and maybe it's also kind of a mental comfort type of thing that we need to get better at. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so I'd say like I'd recommend that, and then I mean, if people want to get in touch, I'm always interested in getting connected via LinkedIn. Then I'd also recommend subscribing to the Uncertainty Project. And then if you're at Agile Alliance this year, please come to my talk. I'd love to hear your thoughts about like meetings. And then, I think the meeting game agenda is going to be kind of like a fun thing for people to try out. So those are some things that I'll just leave people with. And thank you again for having me here. I'm really great questions and just excited to hear what people think.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for your time. That was great conversation, lots of insights. So I
Thank you.
appreciate your time. All right. We'll talk sometime soon. Thank you very much. Bye bye.
All right. Sounds good. Bye.